Hi, my name is Kelly Wilbur, and I am one Catholic counselor. So this is one of my all-time favorite memes. You have Jesus knocking on the door, asking to be let in. We ask, why? He says, so I can save you. We ask, from what? And he responds, from what I am going to do to you if you don't let me in. When I was an atheist, I used this meme to ridicule what I perceived to be the inconsistency of Christianity. That Christians had this idea that God needed to save humanity from himself. And to tell you the truth, the Christians I ridiculed at the time didn't provide very effective rebuttals. So what is salvation? What is it that we're being saved from? Might I offer that what we are being saved from is a broken relationship with God. Now perhaps that seems a bit abstract. You might say, I don't feel like I have a broken relationship with God. So let's put that to a test by asking, what is it that we do to break relationships? As of the date of this recording, I've been married for 15 years, and I have an incredible relationship with my wife. But what could I do to break that relationship? Well, I could stop contributing to the household. Instead of picking up the kids from school, I could hang out with my friends. I could quit my job and sleep constantly. I could avoid the whole family and hold myself up in a man cave to watch Star Trek all day. I could even cheat on my wife with another woman. All these things would cause breaks in my relationship. But what do all these things have in common? They all represent me focusing obsessively on myself while ignoring the needs of everyone else. This is the opposite of what it means to love. In essence, all these examples reflect a type of addiction to the self. Christianity has a name for this type of addiction. We call it sin. We often think of sin as merely breaking rules, but have you ever wondered what the rules are about? In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus reminds us to love God and love our neighbors, and he continues to say that all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. In other words, God's commandments are essentially instructions to us on how to love. It is when we stop loving, when we give in to the addiction to the self, when we sin, that we create the broken relationships I've been talking about with God and with others. So I said that salvation saves us from a broken relationship, and that the addiction to the self, which I called sin, creates that broken relationship. But does this really describe us? Are we sinners? Well, let's listen to St. Paul talk about his own struggles and see if that experience matches up with our own. In his letter to the church in Rome, Paul talks about an internal conflict. He can't seem to make himself do the good things he knows he wants to do. At the same time, he can't seem to stop doing the bad things he knows he doesn't want to do. He talks about a raging war inside his mind, making him a prisoner to unwanted desires. Now, students of psychology like myself love these passages because they so accurately portray the human condition. We all suffer from Paul's raging war of conflicted thoughts and feelings, and much of that is played out on a battlefield between the relationships we want in our lives and our addictions to ourselves, our sin, which breaks those relationships. So what is the relationship we are meant to have with God? To understand this, let's go back to the creation story where God says, "Let us make mankind in our image." But what is this image of God? One way to unpack this is found in the first letter of John, where the author simply states, God is love. Notice it doesn't say God is loving. Love is not a verb here. Instead, love describes the very essence of God. Thus, my being made in the image of God means that I am made in the image of love. Now look at Peter's second letter in the New Testament, where he says that God has given us the promise that we may participate in the divine nature. In other words, we are made in the image of love, and it is our destiny to fully participate in that loving nature. This is the exact opposite of an addiction to the self, the sin that breaks our relationships. So how did this state of misery come into being? How did our relationship with God become broken? How did this addiction to self, this sin, enter our lives? Once again, let's go back to the Genesis story. And we don't need to think of the story as something that happened thousands of years ago. We can see it play out in our lives today. In the story, God relays the following to Adam and Eve. You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat from it, you will certainly die. First, I want to point out what God doesn't say. He doesn't say, if you eat from it, I will certainly kill you. God does not warn of a punishment, but of a consequence. This is the same as me warning my son not to touch a hot stove. I don't say, if you touch that stove, I will burn you. No, instead, I say, if you touch that stove, something bad will happen. The instruction is for my son's benefit, not for mine. This view can help us understand God's commandments not as arbitrary rules imposed on us by some ruthless dictator, but as instructions for how to fully live out our potential as an image of God, an image of love, which is embedded within each of us. So what does the tree in the story represent? Reaching out to grasp of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil represents our desire to appropriate for ourselves the authority to say what is good and what is evil. The Catechism of the Catholic Church puts it best when it says that humans wanted to be like God, but without God. And we can see this throughout human history, from Plato's attempt to define justice in the Republic, to John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, to Immanuel Kant's deontology. Man has continuously been trying to define for himself why some things are good and some things are evil. Each attempt is yet another example of man grasping for an authority that is not truly his. So what happens when we try to rewrite God's own instructions for how to be human? Well, let's compare it to our everyday experience. What happens when my son secretly sneaks a whole case of Oreo cookies after dinner? Two things. First, he's probably not going to feel so hot. That is an immediate consequence. But secondly, if he does this over and over again, the authority he has now appropriated for himself begins to distort his image of me as his father. Instead of seeing me as a father who wants him to be healthy for his own sake, my son develops a fear of me, a fear that I will find him out and become wrathful, or that I am jealous of an authority he has wrongly taken from me. He stops seeing me as someone who loves him for his own sake, and instead perceives me as a tyrannical rule maker, focused on my own satisfaction. And isn't this the exact image of God we see so pervasive in our culture? So how do we get out of this mess? How does humanity initiate repairs to the damage our self-addiction, our sin, has done to our relationship with God? Well, we can't. At least we can't initiate it. We are too weak. But God can, and He has. Christians call this rescue plan that God has initiated the Paschal Mystery. The Paschal Mystery is the restoration of our relationship with God through Christ's incarnation, death, and resurrection. C.S. Lewis described it by saying the central Christian belief is that Christ's death has somehow put us right with God and given us a fresh start. The word Paschal refers to a passing over, in this case the passing over of Christ through death to a new life. The word mystery means a visible sign of an invisible act of God. In other words, there was the visible sign of the historical events, the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. But the historical events are not all there is. Instead, there is the invisible work that God is doing behind the scenes, the restoration of our relationship with Him. Of course, that isn't the end of the story. Through the Paschal Mystery, God opens the door for us to experience a restored relationship with Him. However, we still have a part to play. Relationships are a two-way street. We still need to walk through that door, and we do the walking by participation in the sacramental life, which Christ has given us through the Church, especially baptism, reconciliation, Eucharist, and confirmation. So right now you may be thinking, God became man, we killed Him, and somehow that makes us right with God. It seems confusing. But 2,000 years of theological reflection have provided a number of theories to help us understand. Now this video is getting a little long, so we can save that discussion for another day. And we should always remember C.S. Lewis's warning that the thing itself is infinitely more important than any explanation, and no explanation will ever be quite adequate to the reality. Plus, some people are not particularly interested in how the Paschal Mystery works, and that is okay. We don't all need to be theologians. Lewis rightly observed that a man can accept what Christ has done without knowing how it works. And that makes sense to me. I have no idea how a toilet works, but that doesn't keep me from using one. I hope this video has corrected some misconceptions about what being saved means and what it doesn't mean. Salvation isn't God saving us from Himself. Salvation is God saving us from ourselves.